Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Many people, as they approach midlife, certainly have a fair amount of experiences, some of them that aren't usually shared or very well known to people. One of those that we want to talk about today is going to be something that I think you're going to find not only interesting, but you're also going to be wondering, well, now that we've brought up what seems to be the problem, how do we have solutions to that? This particular phenomenon is known as estrangement, and certainly enough, when we take a look at movies, where you see the grandfather, the grandmother having a nice Thanksgiving dinner and the family lovingly coming together on those particular holidays, loving each other, talking about their woes and their successes and accomplishments, grandchildren bouncing off the knee, and we say to ourselves, but why is that not happening in my life? In fact, my kids haven't talked to me in years, and I certainly never get to spend time with my grandchildren the way I seem to be experiencing here on these shows. What then do we do? Where have I go wrong? Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program is author of the book, We Don't Talk Anymore, Healing After Parents and Their Adult Children Become Estranged. We're going to be talking about this, what it's all about, and see if perhaps that reaches into your particular life and what you can do about that. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Dr. Kathy McCoy. Dr. McCoy, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Dr. McCoy, I can't help but say this. Were you inspired after Star Trek?
Oh, I get that all the time.
Should I call you Bones from this point on?
Well, when I was growing up, there was a TV show called The Real McCoys.
I remember that.
And people used to follow me around singing that little jingle, and I'd think, boy, one of these days I'm going to change my name. And then when I got married in the 70s, I was an early feminist, and I decided not to change my name. So
there you go.
I'm stuck with it with my Star Trek association and Real McCoy association forever.
And it's funny, I remember as a child, just on that particular subject, when the Real McCoys came on television once, I thought that was when I was a Star Trek fan. I was probably about 8 or 9 years old. And certainly enough, the episode I've seen actually had DeForest Kelley, who played Dr. McCoy in Star Trek, on it. And I thought, is this a show about him?
That's amazing.
Now, Certainly we had a lot to talk about just now, but what's going on here now? It's funny because this phenomenon of estrangement is more common than I think a lot of people think it is.
Well, it is, but the reason you don't hear about it that much is there's so much shame around it. You were, during the intro, you were bringing that up in a sense of, you see these depictions of happy families in commercials and on TV and at movies, and you wonder, why isn't my family like this? And you feel ashamed, that your kids aren't speaking to you or you rarely see your grandkids. There's so much shame around not being the way you perceive as normal. And I think every family has its story, its conflicts, and many more have estrangements than you would ever guess. A lot of people I've talked with or done therapy with, for example, will take pictures off Facebook to display of grandchildren they never see, and keep up with their kids and their grandkids through Facebook, but not in person. And they're ashamed to even tell their friends that that's the case.
Now, because you do, have a therapeutic practice, why do you feel we feel shame around this? What's going on there? Is it because we actually align ourselves with these shows and these promises of what family life is supposed to be, or what do you think it is?
Well, I think there's, you compare yourself with your friends, and some people do have good relationships with their adult children, and they're very involved with their grandchildren, and when that's not the case for you, you feel like, gosh, where did I go wrong? What happened? There's a lot of self-blame, and there can also be a kind of a surprise and a not understanding what's going on. For example, when an adult child gets married and suddenly they don't want to know you, and it may be the influence of a spouse who has a different idea of what family closeness means. And so, with life changes and transitions, there can be a lot of alterations to your relationship with your adult child. And, sometimes, too, your own perception of what closeness means may be, maybe not in line with the mainstream. For example, there was a family I did a magazine article about, many years ago, and it was the parents were Italian immigrants, and the kids had been born and raised in the U.S., and I know the woman was saying to me, well, my brother isn't that close to my parents. He's kind of not really estranged from the family, but kind of just not in touch very much. And she said, well, I'd say he only calls our parents maybe, once or twice a week. And I'm thinking, what? For some parents, that would be like we're really in touch, a phone call once or twice a week. But for them, daily contact was the norm for the family. So he was kind of the black sheep because he was, just in touch once or twice a week. So I think families have different ideas about what closeness means. And sometimes, if a parent for whom the family norm has always been constant contact, then having a child who was more independent, they may think, what did I do wrong? When actually they didn't do anything wrong. It's just the way it is. Or individual preferences can, one adult child may be very independent and, not in touch that much and yet have good feelings for the parents, and another may be in daily contact and maybe conflict. So it's really, it gets very complicated. But I think a lot of the shame and self-blame is, it's kind of related to the shoulds we have as parents. I should do this, or when kids will ask for financial help, and you really, if you give it, it's going to put you in a bind, but you think about, well, gee, I should be there. I should help my kids. And so a lot of parents will put themselves in financial jeopardy to help their kids out and then resent it.
Now, it's funny because I know one of the things that you talk about in your book, we'll start right there, is the idea, first of all, that parents will raise their children, and this isn't in every case, but let's say in this particular case, to be independent. And so that time comes where, obviously when you're raised in that environment, a lot like I was, with the understanding, for instance, for instance, I had a partner ask me one time, so what were your parents' expectations of you? And this is, the way I interpret the expectation they had for me was I expected to be 18 years old and moved out of the house. Okay,
yeah.
Now think about that for a minute. There's nothing wrong with that. It prepared me, so I started, working and learning to earn for my own things that I wanted, that sort of a thing, getting out and getting a job. I mean, I was basically modeling their behavior. You go out, you get a job, you earn money so you can pay for the things that are yours. And so when that time came that I moved out, certainly there was a period of time that, I was coming, having dinners on weekends, that sort of thing that typical kids do in their early 20s.
Yeah.
But and you talk about this, so I'm kind of threading my personal story here a little bit with a lot of things that you talk about in here in that realm of independence. But after a while, I just got to a point where, okay, you're giving me unsolicited advice. I'm getting a feeling that I'm looking for approval about decisions that I'm making in my life, but yet there is no personal stake whether I succeed or fail on your part. Do you get what I'm saying there?
Yes,
yeah.
I do.
So let's talk about that for a little bit. Because at the same time, you'll have a little bit of resentment. And again, this is just my experience, but I still love him to death, but I started finding myself becoming a little more distant, that sort of a thing, and not maybe sharing my life so much. And that's not uncommon.
Oh, not at all. I think it's more common than not, and I think you brought up a really important point with this story about. I think when we look at reasons for conflict and estrangement between parents and adult children, there's one of the areas of conflict of needs that the parents, may want you to be independent, may think that's great, but when the time comes, and maybe you're making the typical mistakes or missteps of early adulthood, there's the tendency to want to rush in and give unsolicited advice. And unsolicited advice is one of the most common areas of conflict with kids, because they can feel that all of this unsolicited advice and guidance is a vote of no confidence in their ability to run their own lives. And so that may create more and more distance because they just don't want to hear that. And I think it's a very fine balance for parents to walk at that time in terms of respecting the newfound independence of their adult children and letting them know that the door is open and that they're there for advice if they need it, but not rushing in with advice. And I have a friend who has he has 4 adult children and excellent relationships with them, and one of them has been having trouble just getting into the right niche in her professional life. And she's making some mistakes that we can all see pretty clearly. And I said to him at one point, gee, have you ever talked with her about, doing this or this? And he kind of looked at me and he said, I don't give advice unless she asks for it.
Right.
And I'm, and that's one of the reasons we have a good relationship. I can sit there and I can cringe and I can think, oh, dear God.
Or another way they could do it, too, is sit there and just be amazed about the way they see and experience the world in ways that maybe you may not agree with, but it's like,
oh, yeah,
I never thought about it that way before.
yeah, I think that's an excellent way to do that. And, I think a lot of and we're talking about conflicts and how they begin, estrangement is very rarely, you have one big argument, everything's great, you have one big argument, and then you're not speaking. It's a process. And so I think that, if you're always rushing in with unsolicited advice and, as you just mentioned, with the differences that people might have with their adult children, different way of seeing the world, a different way of negotiating one's way in the world, to be able to sit back with kind of wonder and say, wow, that's, and be open to their way of doing things, their way of thinking, rather than rushing in and saying, you're wrong. And this can really be very emotional when it comes to certain things like lifestyle, like maybe them not following their childhood religion. And that can be a very painful thing for parents who have, feel their faith is so much a part of their lives and the kids aren't going in that direction in young adulthood. And, they can feel terrible about it. But,
right.
I think it's important to just, to be able to sit back and hear them out listening rather than arguing helps a lot in these conflicts because, many times I've seen adult children as time goes on, sometimes they go back to the childhood religion after, or not, but many times they do go back. And so I think it's a matter of not alienating them at one point, while they're maybe doing some of the typical young adult exploring of their options, to just let them know that they're loved even when you disagree, or maybe especially when you disagree. It's important for them to know that the love is constant, and it's certainly important in situations where maybe they're not meeting your expectations in some ways, like maybe not following a career path you'd kind of hoped for them, or maybe they're gay or lesbian and they need to know that you love them, despite or because of, the path they're taking. A very sad story I heard recently. I was visiting my brother, who is a doctor, and he was telling me about another doctor he knows whose son was very interested in history and Chinese and went to Yale and excelled, and his father insisted that he go to medical school. There's a long history of physicians in that family. And he did go to medical school, and he met this beautiful, accomplished young woman in medical school, and of course the big wedding was set up. And the night before the wedding, the young man killed himself.
Oh, wow.
And it turned out that he was gay. He had a secret gay lover. He didn't want to be a doctor. He wanted to, do something else. And and this depression and this chasm between the parents and the child developed because the parents, out of love, certainly, so had this agenda for him. He was going to go to medical school. He was going to marry a nice girl who shared their religion and, have a good life like his father and his grandfather and everything before him. And they really couldn't see or accept who he really was. And, this is an extreme example, but...
Kathy, and I want to stop you on that because that there's a very valid, insight here when you say certainly they were suggesting he become a doctor and go into this particular life way out of love.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now to me, that's a very thin line right there when you realize that in the end this person decided to commit suicide because I don't see any loving attention there from the parents' point of view when they weren't even aware of who he was.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
See, so where's the love there? I've actually just done a big show on the idea of love, and so I listen to that and go, sure, maybe they think it is, but look at the outcome. Well, where was the love there? So anyway.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Daniel. That I think what I'm saying is that parents generally love their kids and they want the best for them, but sometimes they see that as only the best as they see it. Right. And that a parent whose love is unconditional, who, that the kids feel that they can come and tell them anything without, being terrible, is the best of all. I think, quite possibly they had the best intentions, but were kind of blinded by their own worldview of what the best for their son would be without realizing his differences. And he had felt that he couldn't tell them that he was gay without being rejected, which is a very sad thing. And it's not exactly the hallmark of a loving parent and adult-child relationship, although I suspect from what my brother was telling me, these parents were devastated and grieved and had a lot of regret about the fact that they didn't listen more closely to the cues that maybe this wasn't the life he wanted.
Right.
So, but I think absolutely that a loving parent, sometimes it's really hard to sit and listen to stuff you'd rather not hear. but absolutely need to hear.
Yeah. Well, and that's the going back to when I was talking to you about a show that I recently did on the lost art or whatever of love, and we were talking about that was that opportunity that those parents could have grown. If it makes you uncomfortable, use love to learn from this, sort of a thing, and grow yourself, because it opens you up to a whole new world and a whole new way that you see and experience things. And there you go. I think. And you certainly, that's one of your tips, because we certainly talked about at least one or two good reasons why families become estranged, and there are many others. I mean, we haven't even talked about marriage, and the idea that there's a 50% chance that you're going to be remarrying, and that's pretty hard. But let's talk about some of the solutions, and I think we just sort of offered one right there, is to pay attention to that which your child or your parent may be doing that makes you feel uncomfortable, and with love try to experience what that is, and see if you. So that's one. Now I know a couple of others we'll touch on here, is that you also say that in a situation, be the first to apologize even if you know you're right, and I think that's
absolutely.
a very powerful one, because I think of, for instance, the Hawaiian idea of Ho'oponopono. And the idea is that you take 100% responsibility for everything that happens in your life. Mm-hmm. And I'm sorry is one of the first things you say. Please forgive me, thank you, and I love you is the four things that you say.
Yeah.
So whether you're right or wrong, saying you're sorry anyway, look, you were there.
Yes. And you can be sorry that this rift has happened. But saying I'm sorry can really open doors. And again, as you said, taking responsibility for whatever part you may have played in the situation, and maybe reflecting a bit on, okay, I think my kid is wrong, but somebody has to go first. And I've seen so many parents sitting around thinking that their children owe them an apology, and they sit there with arms folded waiting, and they can wait for years, forever, if you don't have the humility, in a way, to say, look, I'm sorry. I'd love to talk. I want to, hear how you're doing and your side of it, and let's work together to try to resolve this. But saying I'm sorry first can really, quite often help open doors, because if a child is aware that you're sitting there waiting for an apology and they're feeling wronged and like, I shouldn't apologize. Well, if you go first, you do it. And the studies have shown that parents have a much greater emotional stake in continuing closeness with their kids than the kids necessarily have with them. I mean, young adults are busy building their own lives and falling in love,
figure out who they
finding
are,
just
certainly.
the right job and living independently and doing all the things that young adults, are supposed to do. And the parents really usually are the ones who want to continue the relationship and continue to be close more than their kids do at the moment. So there's a lot to be gained from saying I'm sorry in terms of reestablishing contact.
And I'm thinking now immediately of a song back, and I think it was 1974, The Cats in the Cradle.
Oh, yeah.
And that's so ideal about what we're talking about, when he comes home from college just the other day. He looks so much like a man. I just had to say, can you sit with me for a while? I'd love to, Dad. But he said with a smile, what I'd really like, Dad, is to borrow the car keys. See you later. Can I have them, please?
Yes. Yes.
I mean, that's such a wise song, and you realize maybe letting go is the best thing to have them come back around. And I'll tell you this, and there are sometimes that I get a little frustrated and even discouraged by how technology has changed people's connection. On the other hand, I will say that Facebook, has been a good tool, and I'm not a Facebook person, but I stay in touch with friends that way, and honestly, I stay in touch with my son. In fact, that's the only way we communicate is through direct messaging. But he posts, photographs of his granddaughter and what they're doing, and I miss it. I'd like to be walking the beach with them. I really would. But on the other hand, at least I'm enjoying seeing how she's growing up. And if that's what I've got for right now, then I'm going to take it.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. And so many families live at a distance from each other. And, so that sometimes an estrangement can be masked by geographical distance. And so, again, that's why some people don't always realize how common it is, because a lot of people are watching their grandkids grow up on Facebook. That's quite common, because you really never see each other as much as you'd like in person, because...
And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because you watch it happening, and then again, you direct message them and you chat, how are things going, and hey, if you're not going to get the phone call, they're never going to return your call, whatever it is. But I found that way, at least, he's in immediate contact with me, as soon as I mess up, well, if that's the way you want to connect, then I'll take it.
Yes, absolutely. Any way of connecting, and you brought up an important point that... when we talk about how to be in touch, many kids these days, adult children, don't do email so much as texting.
Right.
Or the messaging through Facebook or something like that. And I think it's really important for parents to be able to, as you do, meet your children where they're willing to communicate, rather than to insist on a phone call or a letter or even an email, which, we still think is kind of wondrous, and I think the adult children think is kind of antiquated.
Yeah. There's a lot to talk about in this book. Unfortunately, at this moment, we don't have the time, but I'd certainly like to welcome the possibility of having you back on the program so we can further explore this. But certainly, I think we've given people some meaty roasts for Sunday here to think about. That this is more common than people would like to think. And the first thing that you suggest is, look, put away the shame. Things are as they are. The question is, how do we step one step at a time forward to get to it where at least you're going to feel satisfied about the connection you have, whether it's with your parent or with your children. The book is We Don't Talk Anymore. Our guest today, Dr. Kathy McCoy. Kathy, first of all, it's been a pleasure, but could you give out a website people maybe can find out more about your work, how they can get the book, things like that?
It's Kathy with a K, McCoy.com. That's www.drkathymccoy.com.
Great, and let's connect and let's talk about the other side we haven't covered that I know is very common when it comes to estrangement, and that is about the idea of new relationships. We just talked about the tip of the iceberg about getting out of the house, but we cover a whole gamut of stuff, and I'd look forward to having that conversation with you.
I would love to do that, because that's one that's prime. Whether it's a child getting married or whether it's with a spouse who has a very different sense of what family closeness means, or whether it's a divorce, particularly a gray divorce, when you divorce when your kids are adults. And if a new person comes into your life, oh my goodness, that's fodder for a lot of conversation. Yeah,
like I said, I knew that, and that's why I knew, we're going to have to save that one for a part 2 on this one. So, Kathy, again, thank you again. And give out that website one more time.
www.drkathymccoy.com.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us here on the program today.
Thank you.
You bet. We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in. Don't be too estranged when it comes to visiting us at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We do encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter. That way you can stay up to date with what's going on in the realm of Beyond 50, as well as our upcoming programs. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.